Ancient Egyptian civilization is often thought to have been deeply influenced by different cultures. More recently, scientists have pointed out that a lot of Levantine genes flowed into ancient Egypt. But the truth is far more intriguing. Despite the foreign genetic influence, the ancient Egyptians retained their uniqueness, a fact that is truly astounding. Today, I can't wait to share with you an in-depth analysis of the genetic composition of ancient Egyptians, revealing how this people maintained their individuality and developed independently despite various external shocks. Even today, Egyptians have largely preserved this uniqueness. If you think the ancient Egyptians were merely a blend of foreign genes, don't miss what's coming next. There have long been different views about the ancestry of the ancient Egyptians. Some believe the ancient Egyptians were entirely of African origin, while others think they were closer to the Middle Easterners, and some even argue that the Arab invasions completely changed them. However, these ideas only take us further from the true essence of Egypt. Fortunately, they've given us a massive surprise across time. The ancient Egyptians miraculously preserved their unique genetic traits, despite ongoing interference from external groups. Next, we will start by looking at their genetic composition to see why it's so surprising. The chart shows the paternal genetic composition of the ancient Egyptians. Different numbers and letters represent different haplogroups. From the chart, you can see that haplogroups E1b, 1b, 1 and J play significant roles in the ancient Egyptians' ancestry. Today, we'll focus on these two. As for the other minor haplogroups, due to time limitations, we'll save those for another video. How did E1b1b1 come to Egypt? It's an important haplogroup among Egyptians. But hold on. To explain it clearly, we first need to look at its brother branch, E1b1b1b. In previous episode, we confirmed that it came from Paleolithic Levantines who entered Africa around 23,000 years ago. It is now primarily found in North Africa, particularly in the Maghreb region. To understand its development, we need to consider the climate changes in Africa. When you think of Africa's climate, what words first come to mind? Desert? Drought? But now, these stereotypes need to be broken. Africa's climate has been constantly changing. Throughout history, climate has profoundly influenced human societies. The sudden decline of the Maya civilization, for example, is often attributed to climate change. In a research report titled Africa During the Last 150,000 Years, climate changes in Africa over this period are documented. This report allows us to break through time and trace the survival journey of this group. 23,000 years ago, Africa had just emerged from a period of drought, and human habitable space increased, providing an opportunity for the Levantines to enter North Africa. At this time, they still carried the haplogroup E1b1b1b. This group expanded during humid periods and rested during droughts, gradually settling in the region. However, this balance began to shift around 13,000 years ago as the last ice age ended and another humid period arrived. Forest areas expanded, and the environment became more suitable for human survival. E1b1b1b took advantage of its geographic location and quickly occupied North Africa. The favorable environment not only provided an opportunity for local people to expand, but also attracted the attention of external groups. In Northeast Africa, haplogroup E1b1b1 made its move and began to spread widely. During this time, especially in ancient Egypt, the population structure became increasingly complex as different groups interacted and merged, forming the diverse ethnic relationships of the ancient Egyptian region. Now that we've covered the development of haplogroup E1b1b1b, let's return to the main topic and uncover the story of haplogroup E1b1b1. At first glance, It looks similar to E1b1b1b, and you're right to trust your instincts. They are indeed related. E1b1b1, also known as EM78, shares a common ancestor with E1b1b1b, E1b1b1, EM35. They split off from a common ancestor around the same time. Earlier, we mentioned that E1b1b1b came from the Levant, so it's highly likely that haplogroup E1b1b1 also has a Middle Eastern origin. This implies that E1b1b1 might carry ancient Middle Eastern ancestry. However, their relationship isn't that close. Based on today's distribution, E1b1b1 and E1b1b1b represent two populations that have developed independently for a long time. According to the Y tree, E1b1b1 originated around 19,000 years ago and began spreading into North Africa around 13,000 years ago. It has also been found in countries such as Ethiopia and Chad. 13,000 years ago, right, at the humid period, E1b1b1a's large-scale spread makes perfect sense. This perfectly aligns with the population expansions driven by climate change. This expansion laid the foundation for E1b1b1a's significance in the Egyptian population. Moving forward in time, around 9,000 years ago, an unprecedentedly wet climate accelerated the rise of agricultural civilizations, and E1b1b1 expanded again. Watching this, we can't help but say, this group was both lucky and strong. We know what happened later. This haplogroup, which came to North Africa during the Paleolithic period and carried ancient Middle Eastern ancestry, gradually became the dominant haplogroup in Egypt, exerting a great influence on Egypt and surrounding regions. Despite multiple large-scale migrations from the Middle East, it was never completely replaced, as its fate became intertwined with the land, deeply rooted like a tree in the mystical soil of Egypt. The stories of these haplogroups in this land are fascinating, but don't forget another giant, Haplogroup J. Its significant proportion in the Egyptian population suggests that Egyptians carrying haplogroup J also played an important role in the long history of ancient Egypt. Now, let's dive into another legendary story, Haplogroup J. It's a common genetic type in Middle Eastern populations, but today we'll focus specifically on its connection with ancient Egypt. As you all know, there are many Egyptians with J haplogroups. The Middle East is geographically close to Egypt, and a 2017 paper published in Nature Communications pointed out that ancient Egyptians shared a close genetic composition with Neolithic and Bronze Age Levantines. The content of this article was covered in detail in our previous video. For a deeper understanding, you can check out the previous video. If we follow this line of thinking, this implies that these haplogroups must have been present since the dawn of Egyptian civilization, even from the time of the early dynastic period. So, did these J-type haplogroups truly exist as early as the birth of ancient Egyptian civilization? Or did they enter Egypt during the expansion of the Arab Empire? These speculations seem reasonable, but we need more evidence to support this view. After all, without solid evidence, everything remains hypothetical. The truth may lie beneath this statistical graph. The chart shows 84 Egyptians with J haplogroups and the timeline of when their paternal ancestors were still in the Middle East. Currently, a large amount of sequencing has been done in the Middle East, so the time when these Egyptians' ancestors migrated to Egypt wouldn't be much later than these points, most likely within a few hundred years. Looking at this chart, it suddenly becomes clear. The data doesn't lie. In the face of facts, any vague guess is immediately crushed. The idea that haplogroup J were present during the emergence of ancient Egyptian civilization is completely wrong. We know that agricultural civilization emerged around 8,000 years ago, and the earliest Egyptian dynasties were established around 5,000 years ago. Yet, Haplogroup J weren't found in Egypt until around 4,000 years ago. This chart holds many key pieces of information. We can divide the timeline of Haplogroup J migrations into two phases, around 2,000 years ago and around 4,000 years ago. It's well known that the Arab Empire expanded into Egypt around 1,300 years ago, naturally bringing many J with it. Due to time lag, some deviations are also reasonable phenomena. Traditionally, you might think that Egypt imported a large proportion of J at this time. However, judging from the patrilineal composition of Egyptians, J is not a high percentage of Egyptians, about 30%. What about the other period of concentration, which was small in number, but also formed a certain degree of concentration? In addition, the 2017 paper also found that the ancient Egyptians from the end of the New Dynasty to the Ptolemaic period were highly similar to the Neolithic Levant. And in this case, the true integration of the haplogroup J must have occurred earlier than in the Arab Empire. Then, it makes sense to see the influx of people 4,000 years ago. Now let's see what secrets we can uncover at this time. When thinking about foreign groups entering Egypt, you might first think of the Hyksos invasion. But that idea is also wrong, because the timing doesn't match. The Hyksos invaded Egypt around 1650 BCE, establishing the 15th and 16th dynasties. However, their invasion happened much later than the large-scale entry of Haplogroup J into Egypt. Furthermore, their rule in Egypt was very short, lasting only about a century. Combining historical and archaeological evidence, it's clear that they didn't massively replace the paternal lineage of the Egyptians. This theory clearly doesn't hold water. With these hypotheses eliminated, why did Haplogroup J cluster during this time? Perhaps we've overlooked an important historical period. That's right. At this time, ancient Egypt had just experienced the downfall of the 6th dynasty and was in the turbulent First Intermediate period. Meanwhile, the world climate underwent dramatic changes, resulting in a significant cooling event that modern scholars refer to as the 4.0-Kiloya crisis. The cooling directly affected crop growth, leading to reduced harvests, and people were preoccupied with competing for survival resources, causing frequent wars and putting many ethnic groups on the brink of extinction. This situation allowed the Near Eastern Levantines to take advantage of the opportunity to flood into Egypt. It is worth noting that the Levantines had already brought the haplogroup J with them, and their integration with the local population resulted in another form of ancient Egyptians. This is why relevant evidence has concentrated around the period of approximately 4,000 years ago. Of course, the incoming populations did not completely replace the locals. A considerable portion of people retained the unmixed early Egyptian lineage, which includes Paleolithic ancestry. Such a groundbreaking result deviates from existing theories. A paper published in Human Molecular Genetics mentioned the timeline of 3 major migrations of Middle Eastern peoples, with the second migration corresponding to the Neolithic expansion of Levantine populations. Based on the data, I believe the timeline presented in the figure has errors, and the actual expansion period should be around 4,400 to 4,000 years ago. Later, during the expansion of the Arab Empire, a large number of haplogroup J were introduced into Africa, shaping the current paternal composition of Egyptians. The genetic composition of ancient Egyptians is so complex that the origin and development of ancient Egyptian civilization must have gone through many twists and turns. First of all, we must affirm that ancient Egyptian civilization was certainly established by ancient Egyptians. The most compelling evidence for this is the timeline of the emergence of civilization. Multiple studies have shown that the agricultural civilization that appeared in the Nile Valley around 8,000 years ago is considered the beginning of ancient Egyptian civilization. Excavations of various Neolithic sites have also provided important evidence for the emergence of agricultural civilization. The Fayum site, located west of the Nile, is a core area for early Egyptian agriculture. Archaeological discoveries indicate that settled agricultural communities existed there as early as 6000 BC, with findings of stone farming tools, grain storage pits, and granaries. Additionally, the discoveries of sites from the Naqada culture and Bidari culture provide solid evidence for the emergence of ancient Egyptian agricultural civilization. The emergence and development of agriculture also had an impact on the population. We find that only E1b1b1 are transitioned from a long-standing undifferentiated bottleneck period to a rapidly differentiating cluster during this time. Paternal genetic data, archaeological discoveries, climate conditions, everything fits so well, and the conclusion is clear. The establishment of ancient Egyptian civilization is closely related to the populations possessing this haplogroup. Secondly, ancient Egyptian civilization was independently established, but developed through fusion. I just mentioned that, based on paternal genetic data, the large-scale influx of Middle Eastern people into Egypt occurred around 4,000 years ago, which indeed indicates that the initial establishment of ancient Egyptian civilization was not closely related to foreign populations. However, on this magical land, the continuity of such a splendid civilization is also irreplaceably influenced by the Levantines and later Middle Eastern migrants. The migration of Neolithic Levantine populations allowed for the exchange and fusion of different civilizations, ultimately enabling ancient Egyptian civilization to continue shining brightly through the historical river that followed. However, in fact, ancient Egyptians did not only incorporate Levantine genes. We find about 10% of sub-Saharan African ancestry in modern Egyptians, while ancient Egyptians had about 4% SSA ancestry. This 4% is believed to have been present since the birth of civilization, while the later increase in proportion could be attributed to many factors, including wars and exchanges with Nubia, Red Sea trade, and population migrations due to climate changes. But these components only constitute a small part of ancient Egyptians and did not have a significant impact on the development of civilization. All of the above illustrates one thing: ancient Egyptians came from the Levant region, yet they are distinct from other ethnic groups and possess a strong uniqueness. Ancient Egyptians have lived on this land for over 10,000 years, and the magnificent civilization they created has continued to this day and will continue to develop. Such a groundbreaking conclusion left me feeling quite apprehensive when I finished the draft. With only a small amount of evidence, I found myself wondering if this conclusion was sufficiently persuasive, whether the data was rich enough, and if there were any other studies to further support it. Was this issue going to remain unresolved? Just then, a significant surprise arrived. Right when I completed the draft, I suddenly discovered a large amount of unpublished ancient Egyptian DNA data on X, which completely supports the conclusion that ancient Egyptians were an independently developed people. They come from Myro C. Their data shows that ancient Egyptians from the Old Kingdom period were similar to Paleolithic Levantines. Today, the closest modern population to ancient Egyptians from the Old Kingdom is still modern Egyptians, especially Coptic Egyptians, followed by Yemenis. The ancient Egyptians from the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom are closest to Neolithic Levantines, and today the populations most similar to ancient Egyptians from this period are also modern Egyptians, but the populations outside Egypt that are most similar have become those from the Levant region. After reviewing the ancient DNA data they published, I suddenly recalled the data from this paper. The red figure describes the genetic range of Egyptians that is close to that of modern Yemenis, with most in southern Egypt, while the blue figure shows the genetic proximity between ancient Egyptians and the Levant region. The northern region of Egypt, especially northern Egypt, is very close to the Levant. Moreover, the southern populations are, in fact, more closely related to early Egyptians than those in the north. Research indicates that the northern region has undergone more genetic flow due to historical foreign conquests and migrations, such as Romans and Arabs. In contrast, the southern region, being geographically farther from these external influences, has preserved more genetic features from the Old Kingdom period. This might also explain why the Coptic Egyptians, who live in southern Egypt, are the closest living relatives to ancient Egyptians. Combining their conclusions, it perfectly aligns that ancient Egyptians from the Old Kingdom period are more closely related to the bloodlines of modern Yemenis, while later ancient Egyptians are more closely related to Levantines, which corresponds with the information reflected in this figure. The north has deeper exchanges with the Levant, while the south has better preserved the ancient Egyptian lineage from the Old Kingdom period. It's astonishing. In fact, the Paleolithic Levantines and Neolithic Levantines share very similar ancestral origins, making it easy to confuse them when calculating ancestry. This is also why the previous paper only found that ancient Egyptians were close to Neolithic Levantines. It is likely that they mistakenly classified a certain proportion of Paleolithic Levantine ancestry as Neolithic Levantine ancestry during their analysis. In terms of skin color characteristics, populations in northern Egypt that are close to Neolithic Levantines tend to have lighter skin, while those closer to modern Yemenis in southern Egypt tend to have slightly darker skin. This result aligns with the distribution in the figure and the gradient change in skin color between ancient Egyptians in the north and south. Furthermore, the skin color of Paleolithic Levantines was darker, while Neolithic and later Levantines had lighter skin. The figure shows that southern populations retained more of the Paleolithic ancestry, while northern populations retained more of the Neolithic ancestry. This also supports the gradient distribution of skin color. The results of anthropology, genetics, archaeology, evolutionary biology, and so on come together at this moment, and the results are truly amazing. As a unique people, ancient Egyptians' paternal inheritance, autosomal research, the impact of climate change, and rich archaeological findings all reveal their uniqueness. This not only imbues this ethnic group with an air of mystery since ancient times, but also makes ancient Egypt an important cultural source in human history. The story of ancient Egypt comes to a temporary end here. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Egypt's genetic legacy. Until next time, take care.